While Silent Hill and Resident Evil were often seen as fierce competitors since the early days, the rivalry was more of a friendly competition and a one-upsmanship. Offerings from both series reshaped how we saw horror titles, and then went on to make stellar second offerings, which are more revered today, before the law of diminishing returns kicked in and series fatigue started to take over. Yet whilst Capcom's darling reinvented itself a couple times over, namely with the 4th and 7th numbered titles, as well as the highly received Resident Evil 2 remake, Silent Hill hasn't had the same fortune. Not through the lack of trying though, with various attempts of rekindling the same horror with multiplayer and reimagined titles, all failing to hit the same highs as it once did. It could have been different though, if only that little playable teaser was allowed to grow, instead of being thrown away after the result of a messy divorce between the company and the director. It's been 5 years since that feud, with a nary glimmer of a new title in Konami's beloved franchise. The spark is still there though, as shown by its inclusion in Dead by Daylight, but it just serves as a harsh reminder that we haven't had a good Silent Hill game in years. So what happened? How did Konami go from rivaling Capcom in the horror stakes, favouring the more psychological horror instead, before it gradually declined into a terrible horror action series, and then just disappeared? So let's take a trip, shall we? Back to Silent Hill. I'm Ben Roy from WhatCulture.com, and this is Silent Hill, Where Did It All Go Wrong? There's no denying the impact the first game had on the horror market. Back in 1999, Resident Evil already had 2 main releases, with Resident Evil 2 topping many charts only 1 year prior. While Squaresoft had gone in a more of an action-focused route with Parasite Eve, there was nothing truly dark and unsettling in the 3D realm. But then you start Silent Hill. You hear that chilling music from Akira Yamaoka. You find that eviscerated corpse strung up to the fence, and you start to think, oh, this is a new level of terrifying. Harry Mason's frantic search for his daughter in the seemingly desolate town of Silent Hill was a game changer. Switching out the one-man army, macho gameplay for a more nuanced, creeping terror that you had limited defences against. The fear wasn't how many enemies you could fit on a screen, but the oppressive terror of the dark and the fog, hiding sneaky and disgusting monsters until they're on you. It's funny really, as the fog was something born out of a technical limitation, yet it went on to be one of the series' most greatest strengths. And don't worry, we'll look why that backfired later. A tightly packed story, alluding to but not overly saturating the cultish influences on the town, and why Mason's daughter was integral, before pulling out the stops for some dark deity shenanigans by the end. It was a hit for the survival horror genre. Sure, the voice acting was a bit wooden and the controls were clunky, but that's what gave it its charm. The only way Konami's next offering could go was up. Whereas most sequels go for the bigger and bolder approach, doubling down on action and bombastic set pieces, 2001 Silent Hill 2 went down a completely different direction. Not literally mind, as it's still set in the titular town. Whilst naysayers may think that the concept got a little stale, it actually became the sequel's biggest strength, largely sidelining the whole cult thing from the first game. The story was more streamlined into the events of James Sunderland and the curious case of his supposedly dead wife. This time around, there was more life to the town. James crossed paths with locals on their own agendas. That it didn't follow the same narrative from the first worked in its favour, as well as the graphical and technical leap to the PlayStation 2 from the PS1. This saw it garner critical acclaim upon release. The success and reception saw it ported to the Xbox later that same year, with additional content as it was ported over to the Microsoft console. So what could the series do next? If it followed the same footsteps as the second one did, it could start to get a little stale. Instead, Konami went back to the first one for source material, and somehow managed to interweave the connecting stories that didn't diminish or ignore the efforts of Silent Hill 2. It continued the legacy that Harry Mason left, as you go back to exploring more of the town, dark world, and all get to the bottom of Heather's story. Also, don't worry, there won't be any spoilers for anyone that isn't really familiar with what happens, but suffice to say, it told a damn fine story by the end. The fog mechanic was somewhat lifted in favour for dark visuals and themes. It was also well received on release. Despite only being released 2 years after the last game, that Konami switched the story and setting around again only aided it, without cries of staleness seeping in. By now, Silent Hill was 3 main games in, each one riding on high reviews and audience reception. Konami had cemented its place as a top-tier publisher, with 2 critically acclaimed cinematic franchises, Silent Hill and Metal Gear Solid respectively. And of course they had Castlevania, but these 2 are more in the public eye at the moment. But where could these series go next? if not any higher. So it's already been established that as franchises, Konami likes to gamble on each one, especially with a new Silent Hill. It struck gold with the second one, yet fell back to familiar territory with the third. So logic should dictate that the fourth one would be something new, right? The result was Silent Hill 4, The Room, which definitely falls under the something different category. Once again changing up the gameplay of Silent Hill, The Room blended a curious mix of first person and claustrophobic, space-dwelling third-person shenanigans, just for good measure, and fans just didn't know what to make of it. The plot was also one of mild confusion. For one, it wasn't set in Silent Hill, and two, was only connected through tenuous references at best, which were made in previous games. It was the first real divisive game for long-running fans, as its polarizing reception rocked the foundation of one of the once stable horror franchises. Hell, they didn't even put in the obligatory UFO ending, for crying out loud. That's not to say that it was a terrible game to play though, far from it, but from a franchise point of view, it opened the doors of doubt that perhaps ideas were starting to run thin, or where Silent Hill could go from here. And yes, it certainly wasn't on the big screen, as the 2006 adaptation failed to hit the mark. Loosely based on the first game, it was middling at best, but much better than 2012's Revelation. That film was garbage, and at least Silent Hill 1, the movie, is held up as one of the best video game films of all time. There, I said it. It sticks to the source material in some way, and it's kind of totally fine, but we can all understand why people hate it. In terms of where it needed to go, it certainly wasn't in the hands of an American-based climax action group. You know how American horror movies are obviously jump scare loaded and they're very loud, whilst Japanese/Asian cinema is more foreboding, skin crawling and a dreadful experience. They actually let things build. Well, that also works when it comes to the Silent Hill franchise. Returning after a 3-year hiatus, Silent Hill Origins tells a prequel of sorts around the characters from the first title before Mason's first trip to the town, which could have worked if done properly. However, someone at Climax must have gotten wind of the tonal shift. You know that was going over at Capcom with a little game called Resident Evil 4, which was now becoming more action-based. This somehow convinced the studio to incorporate it in Origins. You can just imagine how that went down. Silent Hill was renowned for its dark, psychological, imposing horror, and previous protagonists were deliberately an everyman or an everywoman. Combat was meant to be panicky and a last resort, not a dependable strategy. Origins didn't reignite the waning series to reach lofty heights again, with many criticising Konami for allowing an American studio to miss the point completely. Whilst Origins' story didn't help maintain the overall standing mythos, it seemed that the developer for the next generation's title, Double Helix Games, didn't heed the lessons from it at all. In fact, they doubled down on the combat angle, making hero Alex Shepard a special forces soldier, capable of holding his own. It was insulting if anything. Of course, when Alex's eventually bad thing was revealed, it makes the whole combat heavy notion redundant, contradicting the nature of the gameplay mechanics, of taking out the monsters and the cult behind everything. The cult, who are renowned for being behind the scenes and, to our knowledge, not raising an army of super soldiers. Suffice to say, relation between Silent Hill and its audience was starting to strain a bit after these two titles. Fans made it clear that they didn't want these generic action horror titles. Instead, they wanted to return to what made the series great in the first place. Things were looking better when Silent Hill Shattered Memories was announced, despite only being on the Nintendo Wii, PlayStation 2 and PlayStation Portable. Promising a return to the horror roots of the series, Shattered Memories was a reimagining of the first game, told through past and present perspectives. It was fairly well received despite being seen as a step back by not being released on the mainstream consoles of the time. However, it was seen over time as more of a companion piece, a what if instead of a canon piece of fiction. The PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 would eventually get a different series entry in the guise of Silent Hill Downpour. Again, coming 3 years after 2009's Shattered Memories, Downpour promises another return to what made Silent Hill great to play, the foreboding horror. And in a way, it delivered. Murphy isn't a soldier, but an escaped convict. He's not proficient with firearms and all manners of weapon training. And as such, the combat isn't a first resort this time, which is actually great. This was what we wanted, as was the return of a more slightly open world view of Silent Hill, if you can call it open world. Bringing back lateral thinking and map reading, checkpoint-led horror moments that others were falling victim to. All it needed was a proper return to form, and to tell a dark, sinister story. It was going so well too. You see, what made the story behind Silent Hill 2, and to an extent Homecoming, so oppressive is the nature of the protagonist's bad thing is clear cut. All you have to deal with is the outcome. Murphy has multiple choices and that hardly ever works in games, especially in a survival horror. The impact just wasn't the same, and such downpour failed to hit a high note. Well, neither did Korn, who were drafted in by the new composer, which just about removed any connection to the old games, and that signature soundtrack that Yamaoka had made so famous to the game so far. It's like Downpour was trying to be down with the kids, and missed the mark completely. Again, following its rules of free, the subsequent lukewarm reception of the 7th generation offering of Silent Hill put it on another hiatus. What could Konami possibly cook up next? Late 2012 saw the award go to a game that we definitely didn't want, Silent Hill: Book of Memories, an isometric co-op dungeon brawler. Basically, it was as far removed from a Silent Hill game as could possibly be, and went down as you expect. But that was the final straw, as earlier in the year Konami put out a Silent Hill HD collection for PS3 and Xbox 360. Brilliant, you might think. They did a cracking job on the Metal Gear Solid series, except no. They really didn't with this one. Remember how the fog became one of the series' greatest strengths, whilst being an oppressive element of the in-game world? And it also hid technical limitations. It served all masters. Well, for some reason the remaster sought to remove the fog from Silent Hill 2, making the game look much worse than the original, in the very definition of warts and all. With the fog gone, you could see the end of the map. Silent Hill 3 favoured well, but as it was riddled with technical difficulties, the writing was on the wall, early on, which you could actually see now as the fog was gone. Literally, the fog wasn't there. Why did they do this? To make it even more insulting, Konami only patched the PS3 version, leaving Xbox users high and dry, with an essentially broken game. A broken game which is now readily available on Xbox One's backwards compatibility, so you can still witness the horror today, kids. Yay? All literally quiet, Silent Hill was now presumed dead, until eagle-eyed players noticed the demo on the PlayStation storefront in 2014, under the name PT. As it turns out, this pants-shitting yet beautiful demo was Konami's way of announcing the next game in the disgraced franchise, the as yet unannounced Silent Hills. Anticipation was stoked even further when it was announced that Mr. Metal Gear Solid himself, Hideo Kojima and director Guillermo del Toro were on board, with even The Walking Dead's Norman Reedus having a starring role, before he took up looking after babies in Death Stranding. And you don't need another recap on that divorce between Konami and Kojima. Suffice to say, it was messy. Metal Gear got turned into pachinko machines and whatever survived was. I must mention Scott Telford saved me from that one. That man's a hero. 5 years on, and despite many petitions and fan outcries, Silent Hill, or Hills, is dead, and the franchise hasn't resurfaced in any shape or form. If anyone was looking to jump into Silent Hill, the first 4 games are a must, but of course the original versions and not the HD remasters. Technical limitations and the clunkiness is what added to the charm, not the pseudo-seriousness of the later generation's efforts that the Western developers missed the mark on. From the days of Akira Yamaoka's haunting score and unseen cult influences, to the action-based sequels, one surprisingly okay movie and one terrible adaptation, and cancellations, Silent Hill may never see the level of success ever again. We'll always have our adventures with the Masons, Harry and Heather, as well as James Sunderland, but other than that, there's no real reason to go back to Silent Hill anymore. And that's Silent Hill. Where did it all go wrong? Do you think Silent Hill's dead in the water, or will it return? Who knows what's to come with PlayStation 5, or maybe Xbox Series X? Let me know down in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And head over to Twitter and follow us at WC Gaming, and follow me at Ben Roy Turner. But until next time, probably best avoiding visiting Silent Hill anytime soon.